My name is Roberta Hill. I'm from the Mohawk Nation, Grand River Territory. I'm a survivor of the Mohawk Institute Residential School. I was here as a student from 1957 to January 1961, and I came here with 6 of my family. A lot of bad memories here, that's for sure. These are really familiar to me. I used to play on these, on the girls' side. I was playing down in the basement on the girls' side, and my mother had come up to the visiting area, and the little kids had said, "Your mother's here. Do you want to go see her?" And I ran, but when I got to the doorway over there, I froze right in front of the stairs and I couldn't move. And I just stood there crying. And the more I cried, the worse it got, and I could see myself. I could actually, like an out-of-body experience, I could see this little girl crying. And it was me, and the little girl said, "Well, if you don't you love your mother, or don't you want to see your mother?" And and I did, I really did. She said, "She's going to leave you. She's going to leave if you don't go see her." So at that time, I knew that she would go. Then things just kind of came back, and I just like tears. I just took off running up those stairs. And I went and sat on my mother. And at that time, all I did was cry. I just cried and cried. And it wasn't because I didn't want to see her. I loved her. It was just so hurtful to have to part with her again. Because my mother was, she was a really good mother,
Not much to say about good times here. They're all overridden by the bad. The bad is enormous. There's a tremendous amount of evil that went on here.
So the whole institution itself was run by fear. So it was very regimented, more like a military style. You lined up for everything. You lined up for your meals, you lined up to go to school, you lined up to go to church. It was just like that, follow that routine. And you would be okay if you followed and didn't break the rules, so you learn to follow the rules.
I didn't have the freedom as a child or as a young teenager. I was always kind of under the supervision of somebody. But we got up about 6 o'clock and we were sent down to called the playroom. And it was always cold in the basement. Early in the morning, still a lot of chill in the air, and yet they put us in a big cement room, and we had to keep warm however we could. We learned all kinds of farm work. I worked on a farm so long that I picked up a certain discipline where hard work would get me where I'm going.
And I think at some point there was somebody here that, I don't know if it was a kid or a supervisor, told me I would never leave here. So that really stuck in my mind that I was going to be in this place forever. You're isolated. All you see is this world around you. This is it. That was my world. I didn't learn about all those other things that were going on until my adult life. I didn't know there was all those other residential schools. I don't think anybody in Canada knew that much. So it was kept very secretive, and yet when you start to look at every residential school across Canada, you find the same things.
And I came to the Mohawk Institute when I was about 6 or 7 years old. And I spent 6 years here. I was picked up on an Indian reserve at Moraviantown. And walking on a road. We were going to visit my grandmother one day, a nice July day back in 1955. There was 4 of us and 1 girl, my sister. And we came over that little rise over there and we were heading down here. And a black car pulled alongside of us. And we didn't know who it was at the time. The driver said, "Would you like a ride there?" We said no, we didn't know who they were. We kept on walking and they kept pace with us in their car. And they kept trying to get us to get in. And we refused for a couple hundred yards that way. And they offered us some ice cream and Jell-O at a restaurant in Thamesville. And I had ice cream. After we finished, we all loaded back up into the car, but they never went back the way they came. They went around, away from the reserve. I fell asleep, and I never woke up until we were coming up to the Mohawk Institute. But after I got old enough, I realized I was kidnapped. Like I said, my dad didn't know. The Department of Indian Affairs and the churches, they didn't care how they got the children here.
I believe it was February, about 2 years ago. I was on the Board of Sessions at Chisholm United Church in Chisholm Township. It's about 5 miles out of here. And my first Board of Sessions meeting, in fact, and there was 2 other members and the minister and myself. And the minister was going through the agenda that we were to talk about that day, and she mentioned the residential school system. And all of a sudden I started to shake and broke down crying. Had no idea why. I didn't know what this was about at all. From that, I ended up going to my doctor and for some help for depression, and he referred me to a psychologist in North Bay, and took her probably 20 minutes to determine that the biggest part of my problem was from that incident 50 years earlier. I was stationed there in the RCMP. We had a territorial jail there, which most times I was a jail guard at night. And this day shift, I happened to be assigned to whatever came in through the door. It would be sometime between November of '64 and April of '65. On a day shift, I was assigned to assist an agent from the residential school system to pick up 2 children from a family in Fort Smith, the Northwest Territories. I went to the door of this home, and the woman who lived there knew why we were there. She knew that her two daughters were being sent to residential schools. The mother was crying, both children were crying, probably 6 and 8 years old. And I took the 6-year-old from her arms, actually, and turned them over to the agent. He jumped in his car and took off to the airport, and that was basically the end of it. I never saw them. I don't remember the children's names, but I'll never forget their cries. At the time, I didn't like the idea of taking kids away from their family, and it bothered me. And of course, being in the RCMP, I had no alternative, couldn't complain about it. The only thing I knew about the Indian residential schools was a place where they could get formal education, and I didn't see any problems with it. Since then, I've come to realize what they were about, and I know differently now, and that's part of the story that I want to tell. It took up maybe 5 minutes of my life, and I buried it back in '64, '65. And about 50 years later, it came back to haunt me here in Powassan.
We were sitting at this very spot. I'm not sure if it was exactly the same table, but we were sitting at this very spot at a board meeting. You remember, Ron, you were on the board at the time, and the board at that time had decided that they wanted to study this book called A Healing Journey for Us All. And part of that took us into residential schools. Well, let me say first clearly that I think the residential school history within Canada is one of the greatest tragedies, if not the greatest tragedy, in our whole history as a country. The damage that's been done to so many lives, and the damage that it continues to be done and that will be felt generationally is just, it's beyond one, I mean, it's hard to even take it in.
Residential schools are schools that were set up by the government of Canada, and there are other countries that have the same thing, but it was a policy that was put into place to bring as many Indigenous people as possible into these schools, to educate them into the European way of life, to take you away from your culture, your language, all your traditions, and that's what it's about. In order to sever those ties in your culture and your language, they had to separate children from families and communities. We wore uniforms, you all dressed the same, you had your hair cut the same, you were all one.
And it was to assimilate us, to make sure we didn't have any Indian left in us when we finally left here. They took us to church every Sunday. We had to say prayers and things like that. We weren't allowed to talk in our language. We had to speak English. But it wasn't an indoctrination, like they didn't put us in one room and indoctrinate us all day long or anything like that. It's just the way, the routine of the place. It was in the routine that you didn't speak anything but English. You went to white man's school. You went to white man's church. You wore the white man's clothes. All those were built in. It wasn't a classroom lecture kind of thing. It was ingrained in the system. It was about 11 years. It was taken from them. There was no mother, no father figures. Nobody said good night or come and see you if you were sick or something. Nobody looked after you except that they put us in a big playroom similar to this dining room, and we sort of looked after ourselves.
What was going on across this country that so many children were being taken? So many children were being put into residential schools. And my thing is, if they were such a wonderful school, they were models, everybody should have had them. Non-Native Europeans, everybody should have had a residential school. Not just one race of people. It's a very racist policy, you know. But that's what the intent was. It was to kill the Indian and the child, and pretty much they've done it. So you get punished for being who you are.
It's a school where you were punished for the least of infractions. The punishments were severe.
And punishment for things you never did. You never did them. I don't think I ever did anything wrong that would deserve a strap, never. And yet you got it.
You never knew when you went over the line. They let you know by giving you a beating. Beating sounds so simple, but it was more than that. It was terror, that accompanied each beating.
Fort Albany, when you have children put in an electric chair for entertainment or for punishment, those are crimes against humanity. And yet, different things. And I've heard of other guys having electric currents.
And they brought us into a place they called the press room, where most of the beatings went on, And we went in there one at a time and got a good shellacking with a leather strap, Like, everybody was afraid of it, but everybody knew they were going to get it sooner or later,
Just remember them crying. There was a lot of crying in this place, a lot of tears. And yet we find out it was like thousands upon thousands of children that were being abused.
Despite the beatings and the ferocity of some of the beatings, we still defied the authority to run away.
The boys' side housed over 60 boys. Despite this number, each of us were lonely beyond despair. From within, we each had our own battles to fight. We were lost, lonely, scared, and confused, but our biggest battle was to keep our secrets. Our lives were shrouded in secrecy. No one could know what we all collectively knew, that kids were being raped and molested in large numbers, sodomized by beasts. No one could know. No one would ever know. Sodom and Gomorrah had to be a nicer place, so we tried to escape. A carnal sin, what irony. Those caught were ferociously and relentlessly beaten with the leather machinery belts carried by all the staff, including the principal, the cannon. Beaten until their screams echoed out to the yards and in among the barns, down the laneway and up the city streets. Beaten until there was silence. That was the scariest. Despite this, we ran away. I believe each of us tried to at least once to escape that boy's prison, the hellish place with demons all about.
Yeah, it's open. There's the boilers. At that far end is where I got molested time and time again. Day after day, boy, did I ever wish somebody would come by or somebody would miss me somehow. And nobody ever came. And I just came out of there feeling so dirty, rotten, low, as you can imagine. And I thought every kid out there knew that I had what happened to me. But I think it all happened to them because none ever bothered me. None ever asked me what happened in there. So I think we all got it at one point or other. But it was a nasty, dirty place. But here's where I got molested, right here. I remember standing against this wall there, and he had his way with me. And I was just about that high.
It's the time in my life when I felt so dirty and so all alone. when he had me down in the boiler room and he took my clothes off. And I was just standing there, a little guy, just disgusted at what he was doing.
I think it's very, very possible that children did die here, but we'll never know. It's just I've heard too many different stories for it to be all lies. If they're not buried here, they're probably buried somewhere on the property. And it's just one of those things that in time we may come across it. But this we can investigate. If there's any truth to it, if there's anything in there, just from the people that I know, from the survivors that I know, that say that, yeah, they remember this being something. And you don't just put a window at the bottom of a basement for no reason. I like finding old friends, and Winnie is what I know her by from the residential school, the Mohawk Institute. When we first went in there, my sister and I were separated into groups, and I had one older girl that took me under her wing, and my sister Dawn, Winnie looked after her.
Well, I don't, when I was there, I don't even remember going there. I don't even remember the people picking me up out of my home. I don't remember that. All I know, I was just there. So then I met this older person, this older girl. She kind of took care of me when I was growing up. And she told me when she's ready to leave, because she was in 12, 13, maybe 14, she said that she was going to ask her mother to come and get me and take me home to be her little sister. But that didn't happen because because she got hurt. She got hurt bad. I think somebody hit her on a tree. And I don't know. I think she died, but I'm not really sure. But I don't know. Well, anyway, I've been able to say in the last few years that they killed her. And I was there. I saw what happened to her. Sometimes I used to dream of her. She would come to me in a dream, but it hurts to talk about it. Because I remember her when she used to piggyback me on her back, and we'd run and play, and when I got hurt, she'd pick me up and she'd give me a hug and tell me not to cry. Like, why would she be doing that now? After they smashed her in the tree. You know that sound? Sometimes you can hear it on TV on the murder shows. That sound, that's a sound. Even if a glass breaks today, I'll scream. And then sometimes my family gets mad at me. I said, well, I can't help it. I said, it's the sound. It scares me and makes me yell loud like that.
The scene is a drowning child who, just shortly before, was flailing away with his head above water in a raging river. He can swim, but the river is swift and unrelenting. He slips under the surfaces briefly, trying to catch another life-saving breath, but he knows he's going under for good. What terror is wrought upon the child's mind, no one can imagine. Those thoughts will go down with him. The want to live is seen above, in the light on the surfaces of the river. As he slowly sinks, his hair is silky and wavy, his arms still ever moving so slowly and reaching, for no purpose except that his will tells him to reach up. The lighted surface fades and his body has no more movement except that of the current. He tumbles lifelessly along the bottom and into oblivion. I left thinking that I'd come back one day and attack those people that attacked me. And they didn't just attack me, I think they attacked everybody. But I wrote a book called Dark Legacy, and ever since I wrote that book, I don't have this great desire to go back anymore and beat them up, eh? I haven't forgiven them, but they're not around to forgive.
When I realized the effect that this type of government administration had on thousands of people in my time, it disgusts me that I'm a Canadian, and I always thought Canada was the greatest country in the world. And I'm ashamed to say I'm Canadian because of what my government has done. The government wanted access to mineral rights, mining, lumbering, fisheries, all natural resources that Canada has. And they all are on native land, of course. They were here first. So the government, I guess, determined that rather than go to war with the natives, they would eliminate them. And I know from my own experience, people that I've known, they were raised by whites in the residential schools, so when they were finished there, their parents didn't accept them because they weren't native. And the white community did not accept them because they were native. So these people, and there was 150,000 children, grew up in limbo with no roots, no background, and no place they could call home.
I knew ahead of time when I was going to leave. I went to school that day, and it was the last day of school in summer. Everything seemed brighter then. The grass seemed greener, the sky was bluer. And it was just a great day.
You come home and they're like, you're a stranger. I'm a stranger to them, but they're a stranger to me too. So I had to go find who my relatives were. How was I connected to this community? I knew where I came from. I did know that, but I just didn't know how I fit in.
150,000 people, or children, were taken from their families. And as a result of that, 7 generations of Native people grew up with no roots.
is my friend Carol Cucci, whom I've known for a few years, and appreciate her friendship and what kind of things she can tell us about her First Nations.
So, having my father, my aunt, and my uncles gone to residential school, my father never discussed his upbringing. He was silent. The home that we lived in was silent around who he was and how he was raised. So prior to the age of 30, I had no idea or no understanding of what had happened to my family. And I knew that there was something up, like there was something wrong, but I didn't know what that was. When I was finding all of these things about residential school when I was 30, and my father had already passed away, my mother was still alive, and I started asking my aunt questions. I began to realize how strange everything was. And it began to see what those schools did and what the effect that we had and why my brothers and I had struggled so much with our emotional life. This was wrong. To take children away from their parents and herd them into a school against their will. It just blew me away. And then when you had the courage to stand up and say that this was wrong and that you knew it was wrong when it happened, instead of standing up and said, I witnessed this and it didn't look that bad, I can't tell you what that does for people. I really can't. And I don't care what bad things you might have done in your life, Ron. I know it wasn't a whole lot because you're a good person. They were erased by that. They were completely erased by that. But what you don't hear about is what happens to adult people when their kids are ripped away. And those kids come back broken, but they come back broken to adults that are insane. And that's the other half. So nobody is okay.
I'd like to thank and ask all of the survivors to stand up for a moment and be here with us. Survivors, please stand. The children and the grandchildren of survivors, please stand up as well. Things began to change when the survivors of the residential school experience went to court, beginning in the 1980s. But not really successful until the mid-1990s when the courts finally ruled that they could sue the government for the abuses that went on in the schools and the churches as well.
The root of the TRC is in survivors themselves. Survivors said, we demand attention and we demand recognition for what it is and was that we experienced in the residential schools.
I had a hearing problem. I was mocked. I was teased. I was picked on.
Sometimes I felt that I can't function. I was hurting so bad inside. But on the outside, especially for my children, I tried to be strong.
We were the recipient of their most private moments in their life often. And we as listeners had to be there for them, because we weren't just representing the commission, we were actually representing the hearing of the entire country.
Well, as a commissioner for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, listening to the stories of residential school survivors was difficult, emotionally very challenging. But there's no doubt that when they cried, often we did as commissioners, we always made it a point to repeat back to the survivors what it was that they had told us, because we wanted them to know that we had heard them and that we believed them.
Before anything happened to me, I want to apologize to my family for what I put them through. I could tell my grandchildren, I could tell my great-grandchildren that I love them. But with my own children, I can't. It hurts. It hurts me to think about what I missed.
It was a very emotional time, because the more you got into it, the more things started to come up about residential school that you would start to remember, and then you'd listen to everybody, and it was a very, very difficult time. So I was involved right from when the lawsuit started.
So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was asked to assist the survivors to move from an era of being victims of the residential school experience to becoming involved in a process of establishing a better relationship with the government and with the churches. The story of the truth of residential schools in this country is a story about the resilience of children. They have supported me in this work, but at great loss to the relationships we could have had, and which we will now try to recapture.
Residential school survivors, Reawaken Canada. This is not only about resilience. There's a whole lot of truth that has been shared. It's also about reconciliation.
And there's not going to be any truth and reconciliation in my time or in your time. It's going to take 2 or 3, 4 generations to work all this out, to get it in the history books and have it become commonplace, that the guy next door knows what happened.
The future of Canada, will students be told that this is not an integral part of everything we are as a country, everything we are as Canadians. That is a promise we make right here, all of us together.
It was the closing ceremonies of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Had a 5-kilometer walk from Gatineau, Quebec to the City Hall in Ottawa. There was approximately 7,000 people participating. Many natives, many non-natives. There was different church groups, civic groups, and people just bringing their families out to participate and support the native communities.
By the time the Commission's work ended, almost 7 years later, that we had established the credibility of the Commission, not only in the eyes of survivors, but in the eyes of the country. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has brought an image of Canada forward that now includes this history.
The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation was created by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in order to preserve all of the materials that were collected under the mandate of the TRC. But more than just preserving these materials, survivors right across the country have asked us to ensure that their statements and the other material that was collected finds their way into the hands of educators, into the hands of researchers. So we have a very important and critical role in continuing to expose the truth, ensure Canadians understand the truth of what's happened in this country, and further contribute to ongoing understanding, healing, and reconciliation in this country. Canadians no longer have an excuse, though, which I think is one of the most critical things about this process of truth and reconciliation. The I don't know or I didn't know really is no longer defensible. It's a strap that was found hidden in a wall of a building that was torn down in community in the Couchiching First Nation. And the fellow who found it actually remembers being hit by this strap. And it was hidden in the wall of the building. And the community phoned us and asked us what they could do with it and what they should do with it. Is certainly the harshest artifact that we've come across, and sadly you can see that it has what appears to be bloodstains on the end of it, and you can see that the survivor who found it wrote when he was on at the school there. So that was his years of imprisonment at the school, where things like this were used on children across the back, you know, and being almost collapsing to the ground and then somehow finding the strength to push themselves up again, only to get cracked across the back again. That was the beating set of things. And we've heard lots of stories. There's lots of oral history on the center site. Kids being hit on the ears and their eardrums being exploded and then having permanent damage to their ear, you know, or reoccurring ear infections because of the damage that was done and not healing, having hearing loss as a result of it. Lots of broken fingers, lots of broken hands, broken ribs, kids being thrown downstairs. You know, one of our friends who attended a residential school here in the province saw her friend get thrown down a flight of concrete stairs, just young girl, you know, 8 years old, just poof, down the concrete stairs. So it's pretty ugly history, you know, and all of it done on kids, all of it done on kids, all of it done on kids.
I have a dream, a song to sing, to help me cope with anything. If you see the wonder of a fairy tale, you can make your future.
I'm very hopeful. I'm still a bit scared as to what's happening and what could continue to happen. I want to see action. I want less talk and more action, so we all know that something is changing in terms of healing for the Native folk and for white and brown and yellow Canada.
they're expressing their culture and the good and genuine things about it. The color, the outfits, the dances, the songs.
When every residential school survivor is healed, I'll be healed. And that's how it would affect me. Until they're healed, I won't be. And I'll keep talking to anybody who will listen.
There's always hope. Without hope, we're done. You know, there always has to be hope. And when I look at my grandchildren, I think, yeah, there's a lot of hope. I see positive things for them.